House will come back to order. House will come back to order. Mr. Clerk, you want to ring the bell? This House will come to order. The clerk will read the caption to a group of privilege resolutions.
Honoring the life and memory of Wayne Harrison Rice. Recognizing and commending Helton Alexander on his outstanding public service. Recognizing and commending Emma Grace Hutchinson, Presley Harrison, Trent Matthews, and Jude Harrison for their work at Crosby Chapel United Methodist Church. Congratulating and commending Smith Lockwood Incorporated. Congratulating and commending Nicole Kanata for her receiving the 2022 Yellow Rose Nikki T. Randall Service Leader Award on March 8, 2022. Recognized for February 17, 2022 as Alpha Phi Alpha Day at the State Capitol. Recognizing and commending Dr. Tracy Simmons Fisher for her outstanding work in her community. Recognizing and commending John Redding as outstanding public service and induction in the National Association of Conservation Districts Hall of Distinction. Recognizing March 1st, 2022 is Reach Out and Reach Day at the State Capitol to recognize the power of reading to young children every day and for other purposes. That completes the reading of the privilege resolutions.
Is there any objection to adopting the privilege resolutions? The chair hears none, and the resolutions are adopted. What purpose does Representative O'Neill rise? Neal.
Sorry. Parliamentary inquiry.
State your inquiry.
I move that the rules be temporarily suspended so the bill may be read for the first time and assigned to committee.
Okay, so you had a motion.
A motion.
All right. Representative Neal has moved that the rules of this House be temporarily suspended to allow a bill to be read for the first time and assigned to committee. Is there objection? Is there objection? The chair hears none, and it is so ordered. Regulated Industries. What purpose does Chairman LaHood rise?
To make a motion.
State your motion.
Make a motion that the House rules be suspended so that a bill can be read for the first time and assigned to committee.
Chairman LaHood has moved that the rules of this House be temporarily suspended to allow a bill to be read for the first time and assigned to committee. The clerk will read the caption.
Unnumbered House Bill to be entitled an act to amend Article 1 of Chapter 7 to Title 31 of the Official Code of Georgia annotated relating to regulations of hospitals and related institutions.
On the gentleman's motion that the rules of the House be temporarily suspended to allow a bill to be read for the first time and assigned to committee, is there objection? Is there objection? The chair hears none, there, and it is so ordered. Human Relations and Aging. What purpose does the majority leader of this House rise?
Be recognized, make a motion, Mr.
State your motion.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the rules of this House be temporarily suspended so a bill can be read for the first time and assigned to committee.
The majority leader has moved that the rules of this House be temporarily suspended to allow a bill to be read for the first time and assigned to committee. Clerk will read the caption.
Unnumbered House Resolution by Ralston VII and others, a resolution condemning the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation.
On the gentleman's motion that the rules of this House be temporarily suspended to allow a bill to be read for the first time and assigned to committee, is there objection? Just making sure. Hearing no objection, It is so ordered that that resolution will be assigned to the Rules Committee. Going on now to the rules calendar. Going back to the rules calendar. Clerk will read the caption to House Bill 1.
House Bill 1 by Representative Bonner, the 72nd and others to be entitled an act to amend Chapter 1 of Title 20 of the Official Code of Georgia annotated relating to education generally so as to provide for public forums at public institutions of higher education and to prevent the creation of free speech zones at public institutions of higher education. This bill having referred to the Committee on Higher Education, that committee recommends that this bill do pass by committee substitute.
Chair recognizes Representative Bonner to present the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon, colleagues. Bringing House Bill 1, hopefully number 1 in your hearts as well. I'll put you down as a maybe, a definite maybe. Representative Beverly, thank you for that. In fact, I'm glad you did that because this bill would specifically protect your outburst. Thank you. Thank you for helping out. Colleagues, House Bill 1 will protect and clarify the First Amendment rights our students and members of our campus community in public colleges and universities. The bill seeks to accomplish this in 2 ways. First, by protecting what students may say, and second, by protecting where they can exercise free speech. It protects what students can say by ensuring that public universities and colleges do not ban expressive activity while on campus, so long as their conduct is lawful and does not disrupt the functioning of that college or university. It protects where they can speak by banning so-called free speech zones or areas of campus that are designed for free speech rather than all of the commonly accessible areas of campus. It also clarifies that universities can impose published reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on speech that are content neutral and not directed toward a specific community. This bill applies to, as I said, our public universities, to include our universities and our technical colleges. There is a portion of the bill that does require training both for the students and members of the campus community, as well as those administrators that have to essentially enforce these provisions. And there maintains in this bill a reporting requirement that has been in place by USG to report offenses over time. With that, Mr. Speaker, that is the bill. It's a simple bill, and I would stand for any questions.
Do you yield for questions?
I do.
Chair recognizes Representative McLeod to your left for a question.
Does the gentleman yield?
I do.
Is it not true that the U.S. Constitution already has a First Amendment right?
Yes, that is a good question. Thank you for that. And in fact, I have a copy of the Constitution right here.
Me too.
Along with all the amendments. And I'll tell you, and I'm glad you asked that question, because what I wish we could do, and what I could do today, is to come and take this and set it in the well and say, this is what we'll do. This is what we'll abide by. But the fact of the matter is, we have laws and have to pass laws to reinforce the rights that are granted to us by the Constitution.
Does the gentleman further yield? I just want to let you know how to read the Constitution to become a citizen of these United States.
Well, we welcome you in, Representative, and we are glad you're here, and I'm glad you're here to vote yes on the bill.
I do have another question. Is there free speech zones in the state of Georgia?
Are there
free speech zones in the state of Georgia?
Are you asking about on our universities, or are you asking about in the entire state?
In the state.
I'm sure there are.
You sure they are?
I'm sure there are, yes.
Can you identify?
Well, I'm standing in one right now.
Thank you.
The well is a free speech zone.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'll yield for another question, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes Chairman Knight to your right for a question.
Does the gentleman yield?
I do.
To the gentleman, in regards to the last question, the Constitution, I thought the entire state of Georgia is a free speech zone. Is that not correct?
That is correct. I'll take one more question, Mr. Speaker.
Chair recognizes Representative Moore for a question.
Good afternoon. Does the gentleman yield?
Yes, I do.
Is it not true that these free speech zones on a college campus where we have young minds that are developing quite possibly could entail incitement on a campus?
Ask your question again, please.
Is it possible that these young minds on a college campus in a free speech zone could potentially erupt into an incitement?
So this bill does not allow anything that is currently unlawful to take place. Now, if the question is, will this encourage speech and debate on our college campus, I expect that it might, and I think that's something we certainly need to encourage, but it does not allow anything that would be considered unlawful to take place. With that, Mr. Speaker, I know there are others that want to speak to the bill, so I'll yield the well.
Okay, we have members that want to be heard on the measure. The chair recognizes Representative Walensky to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Speaker. Today I speak against House Bill 1. We had earlier the school bill dealing with safety that we heard, and this bill is about safety of schools. It's about safety of our students. And this bill, unfortunately, makes it harder for schools to protect their students. It makes it harder for schools to create and keep a safe environment for their students. It's undeniable that this bill will make it hard to limit the location and control of where people can speak. Now, this bill doesn't just talk about students. On line 24, when it defines campus community, it says administrators, faculty, and staff at the public institution of higher education, most importantly, and their guests. That's the most concerning part for me, guests. That means that any person can invite somebody on the property, and they get the same rights here as a teacher. So what are the unintended consequences of this bill? Well, for our schools, it will cost them more. It will increase the school's budget. It will increase specifically the school's public safety budget, because right now they get to control this speech and where people can speak. And that's good that they can do that. And we as citizens have a right to question when schools do and don't allow people to speak, but you know why those schools are doing that? To protect their students and let the teachers teach. Now, if we pass this bill, the schools won't be able to control who and how. I understand there's good speakers, but there are extremist speakers. And how those extremist people speak on their campuses, schools will not be able to control that. Schools will now have to be forced to have a budget to prepare for speakers to speak at any time, anywhere. But also not just about when the speakers are speaking, but after that, the increase in hate and harassment that will occur on campuses from those speakers, they'll have to prepare for that also. We've seen specifically on college campuses, for people of my community of the Jewish faith, the amount of anti-Semitism is on the rise. And when people speak and all of the things the schools have to do, well, that's very concerning here with this bill. So from a cost standpoint, this will hurt the school system. It will increase harassment and hate. And today, I believe in this, at some point, we're going to have the Divisive Concepts Bill. So my question is, where should complex and difficult concepts be taught? Well, I think it should be taught in school by teachers in a classroom that's a controlled environment where students can feel comfortable to learn and ask questions, But where should it not be? By invited guests on college campuses who get to say whatever they want? That's not who should be teaching. So today, I ask that you vote no to House Bill 1, especially if you feel the need to vote on the divisive concepts, because they are actually going directly against each other. I think that the schools here in the state of Georgia, our college campuses, when we're seeing a rise of anti-Semitism, xenophobia, racism, we should allow those schools to make a security for their students' decision of who can speak, just like they have been. And you know what? If we want teachers to teach things and have controlled environment, then they should do that as well, and we can teach our kids outside of school. Thank you, Speaker. For my time, I yield the well.
Chair recognizes Representative Dreyer to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to House Bill 1. I want to be really clear first. This is not a free speech initiative, and I'll tell you why. It's also ironic and unusual that we're advancing a purported free speech bill for colleges and universities, while in a few moments we're going to address censoring speech in middle and high schools. How can we do both of those things? And if you look at it really closely, you're going to see a common thread between both of them. Let's start with where HB 1 was, and I want to give the committee and the chair credit for moving this bill a long way from where it started. But I want to say without exaggeration, when this bill started, it would have required taxpayers and the university system of Georgia to fund racist student organizations. I'm not kidding, I'm not exaggerating. There's a national dark money group that has been advancing these bills throughout the country. 2 years ago, I asked their general counsel at the committee meeting, I said, I want to be really clear. If there is a student group that bans members from interracial dating, you're telling me the university system still has to fund those groups? And the answer was yes. The answer at first wasn't yes. There was a few talking around, but eventually we got to the yes. And when this bill came back this legislative session, that's the first question I asked, and that was still the case. And that's just one example of the racist student groups that the university system would have been required to fund. And I tell you, that's going to cost us national, federal dollars, but it's going to humiliate us. It's going to undo the work of decades of people that have tried to build up the university system of Georgia. And it would have been immoral on top of it. So that provision is stripped out, but I want to tell you that's where this comes from. And it comes from a myth that conservatives are being discriminated against on college campuses, which we heard over and over again at the committee hearing. But every single incident that was addressed at the committee hearing had been promptly resolved by the university system of Georgia. There was one case that didn't get quite promptly resolved, even though USG quickly changed the policy to address the concern, but the plaintiffs still took that case all the way to the Supreme Court, and they did it because they had to do it to get their attorney's fees out of the case, because they wanted a win, which entitled them to judgment. But there were no dollar damages against the university system in Georgia because they promptly changed it. So when we start to look at the motives of the two bills that we're going to be debating this afternoon, we start to see what's really happening. On college campuses, conservatives, and let's be real, we're talking mostly about white men, are not being discriminated against. I think that's fair to say. White men on college campuses are not being discriminated against. But what we're doing, on the other hand, is we're prohibiting conversations about diversity and inclusion in middle and high school, and we're prohibiting folks in middle and high schools to saying that we're not a meritocracy, and we're prohibiting people from saying that some people start out in different places in life and some people have different challenges. And I wish that wasn't the case. If that wasn't the case, I would get out of public service and I would go do other things with my life. But that is my mission, that is why I'm in public service, and that's why I'm down here fighting, okay? If you are born in South Atlanta in a poor neighborhood and you're black and brown, you have a 4% chance of ever making $70,000 a year or more. That's not a meritocracy, and that is not a quality of opportunity in our country. And that is connected to the history of slavery and racism in this country. It is undeniable. But if we can't teach middle school students that, if we can't teach high school students that, if we can't admit that to ourselves, we can't address the problem. And if you want to fix a problem, you've got to admit it. You've got to look in the mirror and say, we have a problem and we've got to correct it. But we're not doing that. Instead, we have created a myth that conservatives are being discriminated against on college campuses. But there are costs to this bill. Even though this bill changes practically nothing with the policies at the University System of Georgia, because the University System of Georgia is following the First Amendment, and when they haven't, they've been litigated against. And I'll say this, I filed multiple First Amendment cases against the state of Georgia. I currently have one pending in the Northern District of Georgia and the Georgia Supreme Court right now. I believe in the First Amendment, but that is not what this is about. And we've heard testimony at the committee hearing that individuals felt threatened by some extremist speakers on college campuses and extremist groups on college campuses. They felt threatened, multiple people. Now again, the chair added a couple lines to address that to some degree. But what we're left with is a bill that we don't need. We have a bill that is supported by national dark money groups creating a myth to excuse behavior. If we don't have to address racism, I bet a lot of people would sleep better at night, but we're not going to be able to make a difference about it. So let's just call this what it is. It's an unnecessary bill to excuse some people feeling bad about what's actually happening in our country. And that if you were born black and brown, especially in a poor community, you don't have the same opportunities as other people. And instead of running from that and excusing that and trying to make ourselves feel better at night, we could probably make a little progress on it if we address that. And I'll be voting no on this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the well.
Okay, we have other members that wish to speak on the measure. Chair recognizes Representative Earhart to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. With all due respect to my colleague who just spoke, two things in particular stood out to me. Both of them, I believe, incorrect. One, that this is not a free speech bill, which it most certainly is. And two, that these types of repression of free speech, that's not occurring on college campuses today. Again, it most certainly is. Free expression of thought is not faring so well on American college campuses these days. In some places, the problem is students, and in some cases, faculty, taking grave offense at opinions that merit only minor umbrage or none at all. In other places, it's official speech codes. That's a thing. Or designated speech zones that essentially throw a wet blanket on the concept of open discussion that should be a hallmark of higher education. In other situations, it's students or administrators so intent on preventing offense that they simply avoid all discussion of issues related to sensitive topics. There's a lot to be said for making people aware of the ways in which their words and deeds can do harm. No one wants to go back to the days when casual expressions of racial prejudice were common, or when women were mocked for taking their place, or taking the place that should have gone to men. I have 4 grown children. All 4 of them graduated from Georgia public universities. 2 from UGA, 1 from Georgia College and State University, 1 from Georgia Tech. We had lots of discussions before they left home, heading off to begin their freshman year of college. I fulfilled, I think, my maternal obligation to encourage them and to warn them about both the opportunities and the pitfalls that come with living away from home for the first time. We discussed how to stay safe on campus, time management and balancing studying with social time, good eating habits, it's not easy, how to get along with roommates, the inevitable lure of the partying and drinking culture, and how to handle that responsibly. I thought I'd covered everything, but some things never occurred to me at that time. For example, that I would have to advise my kids that once on campus, the availability of locations where they could exercise their First Amendment rights might just diminish, and in some cases, dramatically so. It never occurred to me to prepare them that when, where, and how their speech was expressed could potentially be restricted by school administrators using subjective criteria in violation of the Constitution. When I encouraged them to get involved in campus activities and clubs, it never occurred to me to forewarn them that depending on the ideology of the club they joined, they might find themselves facing challenges with access to meeting rooms, resources, and faculty advisors. Folks, I support this bill, and I encourage you to do the same, because we must all ensure that the ability of our students to engage in free speech on our Georgia campuses, college campuses, is not suppressed, not directly or indirectly. It is crucial, please hear me, that we never shield our students, causing them to lose those precious, spontaneous, and open interactions that they need, that they require to understand the world and the society in which they live. An education that spares students from unwanted challenges to their thinking is not much of a higher education, and it most certainly does not prepare them for life in the real world outside the college campus. Thank you so much for the time, and I encourage you to vote yes on HB 1. Mr. Speaker, I yield the well.
Chair recognizes Representative Brad Thomas to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in support of HB 1, the Forum Act. This bill defends the very heart of American beliefs, and that begins with free speech, our First Amendment right. Free speech should not be limited to free speech zones. Free speech should be everywhere. Does any member of this body truly believe it's okay to say to a college student, you can express your beliefs in this area during this time? Otherwise, you're limited to whatever our approved language is. My fellow colleagues, that's called indoctrination, and fundamentally against the university experience. Much like this body, we're a body of debate. We should challenge our next generation to debate ideas as well. Even ideas that some people may find uncomfortable, because that's how we work together, and that's how we learn from one another. Forming open and robust university minds, it supports that cause. Now, are there some in here that we've heard with concerns that allowing free speech across our university campuses, it's going to create a hostile environment? You know, if I could just digress for just a moment, on the Seal of Georgia, it has something that I think about a lot. Moderation, right? That's a safe harbor for me. Doing what I do for a living, I try to always evaluate things, find moderation, see what makes sense, see what doesn't, find parity and balance. And I believe that HB 1, it supports that core value. It does it by ensuring that any illegal activity or criminal activity is not protected. It does so by not protecting certain speech that may be unlawful. In conclusion, we should protect our civil liberties of our students by supporting substantive debate on our campuses. And this bill does that in such a way that it doesn't, without incitement or harassment. So I will be voting yes for HB 1, and thank you for your time. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield.
Gentleman has yielded the will. Is there any objection to the previous question being ordered? The chair hears none. The previous question is ordered. We have a minority report and the chairman's time. 20 minutes each by rule. The chair recognizes for the minority report Representative Jasmine Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to ask you to vote no on this bill. The sponsor of the bill did a good job of stating that the intentions of this bill is to protect what students can say and where students can speak. What he failed to mention is that it provides a definition for campus community, which includes students, administrators, faculty, staff, and their invited guests. Nothing indicates that these guests must be on campus through any official invitation process, so a student simply stating, hey, that guy's cool, he's with me, is technically enough, as this bill is written. So any person who steps foot on campus property now becomes a member of the campus community as long as one student is willing to vouch for them. So now that we have elevated guests to the campus to full-blown members of campus on the same levels as enrolled tuition-paying students, we are now granting them unrestricted access to all public areas of campus and unrestricted access to the tuition-paying enrolled students within those spaces. Now, security issues aside, once they are in these spaces, they can protest, distribute materials, carry signs, and more. So basically, your standard run-of-the-mill free speech stuff. I actually don't really have a problem with that. As my colleagues have mentioned, however, the types of things that they can hand out are things that could be considered hate speech. The other things that they now have unrestricted access to talk about or hand out are things related to CRT, or what you all like to call divisive concepts. This bill then goes on to state that these enrolled students who may oppose the views of these now new members of our campus community cannot materially or substantially disrupt this new member of their campus community, except they can disrupt. The line between materially and substantial disruption and permitted disruption, however, gets a little fuzzy. For example, you can't make loud and sustained noise, but you can disrupt as long as it's minor or brief. So then my question is, who decides what's minor? Who decides what volume is loud? Is the person who is doing the disrupting, do they get to decide? Is the person being disrupted, do they get to decide? Does the university get to decide? How long is brief? I think we can all agree that if you ask every member in this chamber their definition of brief, we would get very different answers. So if these things mean different things to different people, then how can we ensure that this law will be applied uniformly and objectively across the board? How can we protect our universities from being sued because of unequal application of this law when it comes to the right to counter protest? See, ladies and gentlemen, the right to free speech isn't for the person who wants to speak. It's also a right for the person who wants to counter that speech. Look, the irony of today is definitely not lost on me. As my colleagues have already mentioned, today you will also vote on a bill that limits the speech of our teachers in the K-12 system by banning them from teaching divisive concepts. So now you are being asked in this bill to give individuals who do not pay tuition, who are not affiliated with the college, unrestricted access to teach those divisive concepts to the students, some of them still in high school, because we do have dual enrollment students on our campuses, as they make their way to class. So in effect, if you find yourself voting yes to HB 1084 today and voting yes to this bill, then that is a vote to be anti-CRT in the K-12 worksheets, and pro-CRT in the college campus streets. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the well.
Chair recognizes Representative Drenner for the balance of the minority report.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in opposition against HB 1, and I'm not talking to any of you here, just so you know, because I know that what I'm going to say is not going to change any of your minds. As a college professor, I am talking to my students right now. And I want to make sure that my students understand why I oppose this bill. I've been a college professor for 10 years. I teach graduate studies in the Masters of Public Administration program. For the last 5 years, I have written 3 books on legislative decision-making and these topics that we are talking about today. Now, I'm not running for anything, Mr. Speaker, but I did want to prop up my book sales. Not really. I've spent probably more time than anybody in here researching these types of measures. They began in 2015 when same-sex marriage was legalized. Religious freedom bills popped up all across the country. Everywhere. I looked through over 2,000 bills. I did a deep dive in who were the people that introduced those bills. Who were they? Who were the people that not only introduced them, but what was their religious affiliation? What was their partisan affiliation? What gender were they? That's a teaser to buy the book, by the way. I wasn't surprised, right? Because I know, I've been in this body for 22 years. I know where these bills come from. And you know what? Believe it or not, I support that. I support your belief in the Almighty. I don't, however, support indiscrimination. And that is what is at the heart of this bill. This bill has some serious conceptual flaws in that it implicitly disguises ideological censorship. It depicts it as protecting, not infringing on the protection of speech. The fact that the legislature is purporting to protect students should send the obvious message that the state is favoring or disfavors the expression of these perspectives. In my classes, you know what? I encourage people to think beyond their biases. I encourage people to use academic rigor. These are textbooks. They have been peer-reviewed. My methods of analysis are sound. I didn't just editorialize my conclusions. HB 1 has a savings clause in it that purportedly limits the scope of the bill to better comport with the Constitution. These provisions that are in lines 84 through 87 state that nothing in the law should be construed to conflict with the protections of the First Amendment. These clauses should be best understood as attempts to conceal or get around the fact that this proposal will foreseeably silence speech. This is really the legislative equivalent of painting a happy face on a sad clown. They do not change the underlying nature of the thing, but only help to cover it up. The Forum Act has a chilling effect on the important protections Georgia's public colleges and universities have to bar discrimination. Personally, I support protecting free speech no matter how offensive it is. But I don't support this bill, and I would ask you to vote no. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the well.
That completes the minority report. We go on now to the chairman's time. The chair recognizes the chair of the Higher Education Committee, Chairman Martin.
I couldn't resist. Chairman England's not over there, but I thought I'd bring a little water, Mr. Speaker. This might take a minute. I want to talk about what the bill does and what the bill doesn't do, because we had a lot of people up here today that talked about the bear in the woods, the thing that's unforeseen. They seem to be able to look into everybody's, heart, and they see something out there that's just quite frankly not in the bill. When the bill was originally introduced, it did have language that talked about organizations, the organizations that would exist because free speech and free ideas are allowed, and how members of the organization would be selected. And that was just a place that our committee felt like we didn't have enough information to discern how the university system should deal with that. But allow me to point out a couple of things in the bill that I feel like are very important. We heard about the unrestricted areas of campus, unrestricted access. There is defined in the bill on line 54, unrestricted outdoor areas of the campus means an outdoor area that's generally accessible. I'm not reading this word for word. You have the bill at your desk. Including but not limited to areas, walkways, common areas, and does not include. So that's what it defines. Then it goes on and says, one of the gentlemen earlier talked about things that it was making it harder to have people to speak. It talks about public institutions, that's TCSG or the University System of Georgia, may maintain and enforce reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on the campus, narrowly tailored to service that. Let me say again, public institutions of higher education may maintain and enforce reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions for the campus community, narrowly tailored in the service of significant institutional interest, as long as doing so is viewpoint neutral. So this idea that you can't have any restriction on where a group, a faculty member, a student, or an invited guest can speak is not in the bill. It's simply not in the bill. We heard another gentleman talk about, and we did have testimony from some students that said that they were harassed on campus. I followed up with that. That was serious to me, with or without this bill, that our students were harassed on campus. In each case in which we followed up, there had been no reports on campus. And the activities that were related to the committee, I am told by the system office, would have been against the campus conduct, code of conduct, with or without this bill. Whether the folks, as it was depicted of us following someone and harassing them verbally, whether they opened their mouth or not, as was depicted to our committee, that is unlawful on campus today by the campus code of conduct today, and most likely against state law. So don't mistake this bill for allowing any of that activity to happen. It shouldn't happen today under current law, and there's certainly nothing in HB 1 to allow that to happen. And I'll draw your attention to lines 46, 47 that explicitly talks about student-on-student harassment and further defines in the bill that that is not allowed, and if conduct and expression rises to that point, it can be stopped. There was also a mingling of ideas here of somehow this bill to be confused with the bill we'll have later. Most of y'all know that I enjoy athletics. I think our young people learn a lot from athletics at whatever age they're in. As we used to coach football, we used to kind of laugh from time to time about 10-year-olds out there playing football, and there would always be one coach that wanted to, you'd have a 35-year-old man out there that wanted to match wits with a 10-year-old quarterback and outcall his defense. That's not really right. So don't confuse the issue of open dialogue on a college campus with what may be talked about next of teachers and divisive concepts at middle school, because that's like, you know, a 40-year-old doing a debate with a 8, 10, or 12-year-old. We're talking about allowing, for the most part, grown adults to enter into conversations for a free and full exchange of ideas. So don't be confused with that. There was something mentioned about this would allow hate speech. As I stand here before you today, our Constitution allows hate speech. I don't like it. Thank you, Mr. Leader. You don't like it either. But what this bill does is it says if that rises to a level to be disruptive in our college communities, they can put a stop to it, to the level that they do not infringe on the First Amendment. The lady immediately before me talked about some clause in relation to the First Amendment that I hadn't heard of today, but I do know this, that we have to recognize the First Amendment, and we can't put anything in this law that infringes upon it. So any reference to allowing activities and speech that are allowed in the First Amendment is, I believe, what some of my legal friends would call the belt and suspenders approach. It's not allowing people to do anything they can't do already. Ladies and gentlemen, I would just ask you to read the bill. It was introduced, it was quite a bit longer than this. It was much more complicated than this. And what we've done is simply made this a level playing field. If you're part of the campus community, as long as you're not disrupting the educational process, you can have an event in an area that's been selected on the campus by in a reasonable time manner, as is defined in the bill, and then you can have a spontaneous activity anywhere you would go. And I would say this, this takes away sections of the bill that did focus on free speech zones. And I, for one, am very disappointed that we had a time in Georgia where our college campuses limited where you could speak. Think about that for a minute. Think about for just 1 minute, if you had to go on a campus and you had to stand in this circle, how much of a cooling sensation would that be on your right to speak that you had to go to a particular place? So this does away with that. I want to close and yield the rest of the time to the author of the bill and thank him for working with us. I want to thank the university system and TCSG for working with us. And I want to assure you that in that work with us, we developed a piece of legislation that will not put the university system or our technical college system in any type of jeopardy for funding. That's very clear, and a piece of legislation that they can work with, and I believe will improve access and conversations on campus. And the one thing we need in our country today is open, fair, and honest dialogue without bias toward one group or another. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would yield the rest of the time to the author of the bill, the governor's floor leader.
Chair recognizes Representative Bonner for the remainder of the chairman's time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be brief. First of all, to my colleagues that spoke against the bill, I thank you. I thank you for your comments. In particular, my friends from the 59th, the 85th, and the 108th. I appreciate your comments. We've had many conversations, and I will say to my former office mate, she is an exceptional writer, and everyone should buy her books. But what we saw here today, to me, certainly highlights that need for free speech. And frankly, I wish we didn't have to bring a bill like this before the legislature. But unfortunately, there are times when we must reinforce through state law those rights that we know exist. Right now, it's governed, essentially governed by rule of USG, and we say they adjust those rules. Well, they do. They're good about adjusting those rules up until another court case comes up. Then they've got to adjust them again. So a question I would ask is, how many more court cases do we need? Because keep in mind that every time the university system defends themselves, every time that they settle a case, like they did in Georgia Tech, Students for Life versus the state, they settled for $50,000. And I'll tell you, do you know where that $50,000 came from? That came from me, and that came from you, because that's taxpayer money. So unfortunately, there are times when we have to do that. There was a lot of talk about the speech and the types of speech, and what I basically took some notes on is that essentially what I was hearing is there's speech that we simply don't like. But I'll just tell you, the cure to overcoming bad ideas is not to limit speech, but it's to increase the amount of speech. Because if your idea is better than my idea, then we need to debate that in the arena and let the best idea win. At the end of the day, my friends, this is a simple bill. It simply says that all will be treated the same and that all will play by the same rules. So with that, colleagues, I would urge your favorable consideration for House Bill 1. Thank you. I yield the well.
Is there any objection to adopting the committee substitute? The chair hears none. The committee substitute is adopted. Is there any objection to agreeing to the report of the committee, which was favorable to the passage of the bill? The chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Shall this bill now pass? All those in favor of the passage of House Bill 1 will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no, and the clerk will unlock the machines. What purpose does Chairman Werkheiser arise?
Parliamentary inquiry.
State your inquiry.
Is it not true that every day in rules there's a motion made and then carried to limit debate for an hour? Has there ever been any consideration or discussion that might want to look at 10 minutes or so?
You get no objection from the chair, I'll tell you that. All right, we're going to do one more parliamentary inquiry. What purpose does Representative Walensky rise?
Parliamentary
State
inquiry.
your inquiry.
Is it not true that we would never allow random visitors to visit the UGA football team to protect their mental health and keep them focused on the game? But in this bill today, we're allowing random visitors to come to campuses and not giving the same protection to the students?
I'm not sure I understood your inquiry, but if you're defending the integrity of our football program, then the answer is yes, okay? All right. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? If so, the clerk will lock the machines. On the passage of House Bill 1, the ayes are 93, the nays are 62. This bill, having received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore passed. What purpose does Representative Cannon rise?
To make a motion,
What's your motion?
I'd like to move this be reconsidered on the next legislative day.
You are serving notice that you're going to ask that this vote be reconsidered.
Correct.
Okay. Lady has that right. We'll take it up on Tuesday. We'll take the motion up. Clerk will read the caption to House Bill 1084.
House Bill 1084 by Representative Wade of the Ninth and others to be entitled an act to amend Title 20 of the Official Code of Georgia annotated related to education so as to prevent the use of and reliance upon curricula or training programs which act upon, promote, or encourage certain concepts with exceptions. This bill having been referred to the Committee on Education. That committee recommends that this bill do pass by committee substitute.
Chair recognizes Representative Wade to present the bill.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Speaker. I am here to present a bill, House Bill 1084. It's called the Protecting Students First Act. And if I could have everyone's attention, I really want to remind us of how we started our day when our chaplain discussed the concept of unity. And I understand that there are people that have varying opinions on this bill, and I even appreciate a colleague earlier sharing concerns about my bill when speaking against a different bill. But I really want us to have a conversation about what this bill does, what this bill does not do, and I hope that you'll listen intently and keep the children of this state at the center of this conversation. In recent months, national attention is focused on public education as well as educational trainings, including some divisive concepts, including racial discrimination. That's racial discrimination against all races. That's about stereotyping and scapegoating different students. This currently is happening rarely in Georgia, but it's happening. And I believe we must do something to be proactive to prevent it. I don't believe that we need to teach young students that an individual's moral character is based on their race, or that the United States is fundamentally racist, or that an individual bears responsibility for the past actions of others of the same race. It runs counter to the core belief that all human beings are created equal, regardless of race or their ethnicity or their sex. It also sets back decades of progress made since Dr. King and many others dreamed that men and women would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. HB 1084 seeks to address the teaching of a very limited number of specific divisive concepts, while also providing a recourse for concerned families, ensuring their voices are heard and legitimate, realistic complaints are investigated, and a discussion and a process are handled first at the local school system. And if needed, actually first at the local school, and then if needed at the local school system, and then the worst case scenarios potentially going on to the state board. This bill is focused on protecting students from the far radical ideologies that the media promulgates from, I believe, the loudest and sometimes the most unthoughtful sides of our parties. The classroom is dealing with children and students that are not adults. The last bill that was presented was discussing adults. By and large, mostly 18-year-olds and above. Occasionally, through dual enrollment, there are some students that are 17. I agree with that. But ultimately, I believe that we need to focus on what the language of the bill says. If you look at page 2 of the bill, we've outlined 9 divisive concepts. This is so that teachers don't teach these specific things and only these specific things. I've also ensured that we listened to and we worked with associations like the Georgia School Board Association, GSSA, GALE, GAE, the Anti-Defamation League, and even the ACLU. We went through a thoughtful process of hearing their concerns about how to address what I believe is a very important conversation for us to have, and that is to support teachers and parents and students all equally when there are difficult and confusing situations that happen, especially during the development of the children of this state. This legislation is not going to touch funds of schools. This legislation is not going to prevent the teaching of divisive concept, as you have heard today. It's not going to change anything within the Georgia standards. At some point during this debate, you're going to receive a copy of the Georgia standards. The Education Committee members had an opportunity to receive the Georgia standards relating to the history of slavery, the history of racial discrimination from the onset of this nation, as well as other nations in this world. Whether it be United States history, world history, or Georgia history, this bill will not change one Georgia standard at all. It is limited to the 9 divisive concepts. And I will share that when we went through this, I had a really great conversation with folks that were not in my party, that were on the other side in the minority, and they shared their thoughts and concerns. I've not had a member come to me and tell me that they had any major concern with any of the divisive concepts outlined. I had a couple of members said that they thought line 30 was up for debate. And I believe there's a distinction between is and was, and we had that debate in committee, and I respect those members that think that way. But ultimately, my goal as a legislator is to represent all students and what is in the best interest of all students, not trying to appease the loudest voices of those who may be the most angry. This bill will ensure that a process happens locally. This bill will support teachers and parents with a thoughtful, meaningful way to address when an issue arises around racial discrimination. This will benefit all students. This will benefit students in North Georgia, in South Georgia, in Metro Atlanta, in urban centers, and the ruralist part of this state. I really appreciate the opportunity to have worked on this bill because I truly believe in something that was instilled in me by my father and my mother, who are both educators. They spent their entire career teaching children, young and old, middle school, elementary, and even high school. I was a school board member for 15 years for the school system that I was a product of. I understand that we have issues related to barriers, to situations where people all start out in a different manner. Poverty is a major issue that has affected this state. That's affected all races. And I think that we need to ensure that rigorous instruction continues. If you'll note lines 81 through 100, we ensure that every teacher will continue to be supported in teaching the history, their courses in a rigorous, academically professional manner. But folks, this state went through a process of ensuring that we do not proselytize our faith in the classroom. And that was a hard process to go through as a state. But teachers adjusted. They understood that it wasn't appropriate for them to indoctrinate a student based on their individual faith belief system. I look at the world today and I see the political polarization that we have. And there is a distinction between K-12 and how we approach history, and then how we allow younger adults in a college setting to have the freedom of speech to discuss those things. But folks, we have to come together as a nation. Look at the world around us. I shared this statistic, and I'm almost finished with my open remarks, but this is important to me, and I hope it's important to you. There are over 40,300,000 human beings who are living in modern-day slavery on this planet. It has gone unaddressed because there's a lot of places in the world that aren't like America, that know how to face where we've been. Are we where we need to be? No. I know that. But before my dad passed on March 11th of 2021, he instilled in me a desire that he had as a student and as a young person who grew up in a little town called Leslie, Georgia, Sumter County. He grew up as a sharecropper. He lived in a dirt floor, one-room place. His dad died as a crop duster when he was less than 2 years old. He learned to live with people who didn't look like him. He, through his faith, learned that we were all created equal. When, as he told the story to my brother and I, when he made big time and was accepted to a fellowship at LaGrange College through a church foundation, that, and his words was, they felt so sorry for me. They wanted me to see what a bigger town looked like. And he was pretty good at reading. He got to go to college. And he started experiencing that people started judging people based on the color of their skin and not the content or the character or the opportunity that they possess in their human race status. My dad taught me, son, if you have an opportunity, you always need to feed love and starve hate. This bill's aim is to prevent the radical ideologies of our national media to interject themselves through individual teachers proselytizing their personal political beliefs. The best teachers that I had, even the best professors I had in college, I didn't know how they voted. I didn't know their political affiliation. We definitely don't need fifth graders in classrooms in which the teacher's political registry is known. This bill, I believe, goes a long way to address those issues, and I appreciate everyone who's provided feedback. And I know that there's going to be some folks that vote no against this because there's a political season. What I've tried to do with this bill is to address the concerns of parents that have called me, of teachers that have called me, school board members, family members that believe that we can be a United States and that we have an opportunity to continue in the pursuit of the most precious dream, which was MLK's, and that's to end racism. That's my aim. That's my heart. Are we perfect? No. But those 9 items Look at those divisive concepts that are outlined. Lines 26 on page 2. Read them. We can debate if you think fully that one of those should be taught, that those should be taught to students. I'll accept your opinion. You as an American have that right. But I believe in a K-12 setting that those have been carefully considered, and I appreciate your favorable consideration on this bill, and I would yield for any questions.
You have a fair number of questions. Do you yield?
I'll yield for a couple of questions.
Let's see here. Chair recognizes Representative Hutchinson. To your right for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the gentleman yield?
I certainly do.
Can my seatmate give me an example of any curricula in Georgia that includes, that is taught that an individual's moral character is inherently determined by his or her race?
So the goal of the legislation is to ensure that that's not taught. And I was given about 7 examples, 2 of which happened in Georgia schools that I shared with our education committee that would fall into that category for a local school system, for a parent and a school teacher and a student to sit down and determine if that teacher's behavior, and even in some cases if the student's behavior related to that issue was appropriate. So it doesn't happen often, but my goal is to make sure that it doesn't happen.
Does the gentleman further yield?
I certainly do.
Can you give me an example of any Georgia curricula that claims that an individual of a particular race consciously and by virtue of his or her race is inherently racist or is inherently inclined to oppress individuals of other races?
Thankfully, in our Georgia standards, that does not exist.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you further yield?
This will be my last, yes, sir.
Chair recognizes Representative Brad Thomas to your right for a question.
Thank you, Representative Wade. Do you yield?
I do for my friend, yes, sir.
Is it not true that in Gwinnett County, the school board chair has got several videos on TikTok stating comments such as privilege, that white people have privilege just because of the color of their skin, that they are inherently racist or socialized racists, and furthermore has also gone on record as saying that that people with black and brown colored skin have advantages that white people do not have.
I believe the gentleman is sharing information that was provided to us in our committee, and I believe what he states is true.
Thank you, Mr. Wade.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the conversation. I think there's other folks that want to speak to this bill, and at this time, I'll yield the well.
Chair, there are a few others that wish to be heard. Chair, reminder that 30 minutes of debate, and that can be allocated at your discretion amongst all the speakers. Chair recognizes Representative Erica Thomas to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today I see that we may need some waking up and a little bit of livelihood. So I say that we open up my speech as if we are in a classroom. So I have a question. What is the Georgia motto? It's wisdom, justice, and moderation. So let's talk about wisdom. How can we believe to instill wisdom in our K-12 students without giving them knowledge? How can we instill wisdom without telling them American history? How can we say that our Georgia motto is justice without teaching them about justice in the state of Georgia? How can we stand here and vote for the citizens arrest bill and not talk about how the justice system failed Ahmaud Arbery? and not tell the full story of how it took 74 days for the murderers of Ahmaud Arbery to be arrested. That's history. And how can we stand here and compare slavery to things that didn't happen to our counterparts? It's a question that I have, and it is a question that my constituents have. So let's go back to the justice system. The justice system is something that we do study in school. And again, it was not created for us, when I say people of color, or by us. Again, I say 74 days was how long they covered up the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And it took the NAACP, it took protesters, and it even took one of our allies here, Representative Al Williams, fighting to make sure that the justice system, as we see it and as we teach it, stands for us. You know, it's uncomfortable, and everybody's talking about the words critical and divisive. We're using all these languages, and our children are feeling uncomfortable. Yes, it is uncomfortable for your counterparts to hear about slavery, but it's also uncomfortable for people of color to hear about slavery. It's uncomfortable to hear about stories of when our people were enslaved and their child turned 10 and they were snatched away from them to be sold for $1. It is uncomfortable to hear about when a slave heard that his wife was being raped by the master, that guess what? He was beaten to a pulp. That's uncomfortable. And it's not just uncomfortable for one side of the aisle, and it's not just uncomfortable for the other side of the aisle, but guess what? When do we stop being uncomfortable? And when you're uncomfortable, you start to grow. And how can we talk about our future if we can't teach kids about our past? It's uncomfortable. It's divisive. It's critical. But it is American history. Let me tell you what else is uncomfortable. Putting your kindergartner on the bus for the first time and seeing them wave at you as they leave, that's uncomfortable. Riding a bike for the first time and falling 10 times off the bike until you figure it out, that's uncomfortable. Hey, when you have a smart student that skips the 2nd grade all the way to the 5th grade and doesn't know anything about 5th graders or how they will respond to them, that's uncomfortable. But we do all of those things to grow. I'm not going to tarry long in my classroom today, but I do want to end with this. It's not just about Black history being uncomfortable and teaching Black history, because that's not what we're not going to do that today. It's also about Native American history and how villagers were burned at a stake while they were asleep just so someone else could take their property. That's American history. Slavery is American history. And if we want to say who can teach it, how they teach it, so they don't make us feel uncomfortable, this is what I say to them. You either teach all of history or don't teach it at all. I yield the well.
Chair recognizes Representative Becky Evans to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hello, colleagues. Good afternoon. It's been very interesting, all our conversations this afternoon talking about First Amendment rights and free speech. I want to say I highly respect the bill's sponsor, Representative Wade, and I recognize that he's made many edits to this bill in response to feedback. However, House Bill 1084 remains highly problematic, and I am speaking in opposition to this bill. I especially find it troubling and ironic and frustrating that this body slipped in a vote yesterday in House Bill 517 that doubles the $100 million diverted from the general fund annually in the form of tax credit for private schools to $200 million in 5 years. These private schools will not be held accountable to these laws we've been talking about today, while we add administrative burdens, unnecessary burdens, on our public school teachers and leadership. I've been listening to teachers and students in our community, in my community especially. Let teachers teach and let students learn. Hands off our education. Trust our teachers. Over 200 thoughtful, energetic, and democracy-loving young people from my community gathered here at Liberty Plaza last week. I share their concerns that this bill will rob young people of an inclusive education and suppress speech about race and racism. Classroom censorship bills about race and racism, like House Bill 1084, are at the cross-section of racial justice and the First Amendment. Our students have, and I think we've been talking about this today, a First Amendment right to hear accurate information in our schools. I'm especially concerned about how this bill could affect crucial conversations between students and teachers about our recent history and current events. I remember watching the budget appropriations hearings, and Senator Blake Tillery made a point to the USG president: we need to teach our students to be critical thinkers. If this law is passed, will our teachers shy away from asking hard questions that they know will challenge their students? In referring to lines 38 and 39 in the bill, and this is something I asked in committee, that's where it says students shouldn't feel anguish or psychological distress because of their race. Of course we agreed. No teacher should ever teach that. However, I am concerned that where a student, upon learning some of our hard history, such as Rosa Parks and the bus boycott, as Representative Wade talked about with his daughter, lynchings of blacks in the Jim Crow South, or internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, that a student may feel anguish or psychological distress because they're human and have empathy and they have emotions. And most people, those of us in this room, would be like Representative Wade and have that hard conversation with their children about discrimination in America. But a family member who holds prejudices may resent their child feeling those emotions and allege that the teacher made the child feel that way. How does the teacher defend himself or herself? I'm concerned that this law may create an atmosphere or lead to an atmosphere of distrust. Do we need to get body cameras on all our teachers to defend themselves? And along the same line, how do we prevent multiple inaccurate allegations that an educator has taught a prohibited concept, particularly those that teach history, economics, or other subjects within the social sciences that cover race, race inequities, discriminatory laws and policies, and other topics that are controversial? And how do we monitor the effects on teacher retention? I'm thinking of a cautionary tale of a teacher, Matthew Hahn, a teacher who's white from Kingsport, Tennessee, with 16 years experience, who in his contemporary issues class exposed his students to the concept of white privilege, and he was fired for it. During the school board hearing, several of his former students came to speak upon his behalf, and one, Christian Thomas, said, I quote, "Before meeting Hahn, I don't know if I could have been the type of guy to listen to other people's arguments or see from their point of view." And let's listen to the voices of students like Katie Gunther, one of the Decatur students who spoke at the rally. If this bill passes, teachers and students would live in fear of saying the wrong things, stymieing free thought and new ideas. the kind of discussion that prepares us for the real world by learning about our past and our present and each other just wouldn't exist in Georgia. All the while, students who will suffer the most from these bills would be trapped in public schools that refuse to teach them anything but a whitewashed history. So Katie asks us, what kind of state do we live in? What kind of state do we want to live in? She says 1084 scares the next generation of thinkers from Georgia. I love this state and I want to live here freely just as I would anywhere else. I see my future in Georgia. I live in a state that has a diversity of thought and people, where my neighbor looks and feels differently from me, and that's okay. I want myself and every student in Georgia to feel safe whenever they walk into any school of any kind. Places of education should be safe spaces for thought and speech. I agree with you, Katie, and colleagues, I hope you do too. I hope that we can vote no on this bill and let teachers teach and students learn. Our kids should learn about what we've done right and wrong in our history so they can celebrate the progress we've made and continue making it in the future. We can talk about race and racism here in Georgia. We can teach our children to love America and to love the truth. Mr. Speaker, I yield the well.
Chair recognizes Representative Cannon to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hello, members. I'm rising in opposition to this bill. I'm the youngest woman member in this chamber, and I am a current educator to Georgia students, which is why you've seen I might not have been here a few days, because our students need to be taught. I have been contacted by more than 200 parents, students, and school board members who oppose this bill. This is a vehicle for student inquiry to be considered divisive. I want to tell you 2 reasons that I'm against this bill. The first is I am a product of Georgia Public Schools, and I have been subject to its curriculum more recently than any of you here. It's nearly impossible to comply with lines 38 and 39 that say an educator may not teach a divisive concept to which an individual should feel anguish or any other form of psychological distress. I have felt psychological distress here learning about racism in my county and in Georgia. But unfortunately, some of the things that have happened in my home county of Lee County and Dougherty County and Albany with the Lee County Stockade were not being taught in public schools when I was in schools. It's being taught now. The unlawful arrest that happened on March 25th last year in this Capitol is being taught in public schools. I ask if you think that was divisive, because students are facing psychological impact because they have empathy. And I think that when students have empathy and those empathy moments are turned into complaints, this adds to what our school boards cannot do. In fact, the Atlanta Public School Board passed a resolution last month against this bill and are asking that you vote no today, or at least take a courageous walk. The second reason I'm against this bill, so I can close out, is it initiates what could be a 12-week process, which is 3 months out of the 9-month school calendar, against educators. It implicates them against school boards. They have to review the complaints. It implicates the school board against the Department of Education to determine whether the rule was violated. I'll finish by saying I've taken a look at the Georgia Department of Education Standards of Excellence, GSE. As of August 21st, 2021, this is what we're teaching in schools right now. There are at least 4 standards that would immediately need to be changed within 77 days of this bill being signed. That is SS 4H6, SS 8H10, SS 8H11, SSS, SC1, SSS, USS2, and SSWG2. If this bill does not address those specific GSE methods that need to be changed, I believe that all of our votes are flawed. I hope that you'll vote no. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative Carter to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Speaker Ralston. Good afternoon, members of the Georgia House of Representatives. I rise to oppose House Bill 1084. My hope, when I finish and when it's time to vote, you will join me in voting no. This is the bill. I've read it a few times, and each time I read this bill, I come with the same question, and I ask the author of the bill, why? How do we get here? My friend, you're long-winded. And he talked for a long time, and when he finished, I still had the same question, why? But he finally answered, and he said that we were being proactive. You know, there's a definition for proactive, and I'm not going to read it to you, but here I'll sum it up. You know, when we're being proactive, sometimes we're creating a solution in search of a problem. As he testified here this afternoon, the concepts and concerns in this bill is not being taught in Georgia schools. The author of HB 888 decided to share with you that the comment from the Gwinnett School Board member, again, not in the classroom. As a black female, grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, went to public school with children, I agree that no child should be taught that they are inherently evil. They should not be taught that one race is inherently superior to another. They should not be taught that an individual, by virtue of his race or her race, is inherently or consciously racist or oppressive toward individuals of other races. And what's interesting with these items that are defined between lines 29 and 42 of this bill, some of you have seen this language before. It was in the executive order signed by the former President Trump. So this is not creative language that happened in Georgia. It came from the executive order. And so what's happening now in Georgia, we have decided that Washington is going to dictate what happens in our schools. The other thing in this bill, it talks about the processes for and the consequences. Well, the process could start with a child going home telling their parents something that may or may not be true, could be true. Then the administration has to address that issue, and then if that parent or whoever that person that made the complaint is not satisfied, they get to take it to the school board. And then if they are not satisfied with what happens at the school board, it goes to the state level, at the state school board or the state superintendent. If in fact they decide at that level that this action was in effort violating these concepts in this law, these school systems could lose waivers. There is nothing in here that addresses the teacher or the individual that caused the issue. The school system is who is going to be feeling the consequences. Then let's talk about the Professional Standards Commission, which certified teachers in Georgia. In this bill, it talks about how the certification cannot include various types of languages or what we are now codifying in the law that define these items that I just shared with you. But that isn't even the role of the Professional Standards Commission. So here's where we are. You guys are going to pass this bill. Some teachers going to mess up, right? But we don't even have a system in place in this legislation to support the teacher. And then what happens to our children that have hard questions? This teacher's not going to answer those questions because they don't want to violate this code that we're codifying into the law that came from the former president of the United States. So, as a mom, I just want to plead with you for once, since we want to unify, let's vote no. And then let's do something different, right? Why don't we come together in the education committee and talk to each other about what is really happening in our classrooms, and then we work together to come up with legislation that makes sense, because this doesn't. Speaker Ralston, I yield the will.
Chair recognizes Representative Wilson to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, let's use some common sense here, shall we? The only reason that we can stand here and discuss which concepts are divisive, whether they are or not, and whether they should be taught in school or not, is because we learned them in the first place. If you think for a second that kids are not going to learn about racism in our society today, and they're not going to talk about it in schools, you are fooling yourselves. All this bill does is muzzle our teachers and make them into a straw man for political gain from the true divisive voices in our communities. I say this to you as a former 6th grade teacher. There is no better place to discuss difficult concepts and events than in the classroom, a safe space for our students, where our trained educators can also teach them the skills to discuss, consider, question, and even reject ideas, but to do so in a healthy and respectful manner. These, by the way, are the same skills, the same life skills that our children need to thrive in our modern global economy. Rational thought, critical thinking, civil discourse, mutual respect, humility, debate, spirit of generosity. And you and I say to one another all the time in this room, there is no set of skills more needed in society right now. Because what we have today is a society full of folks that cannot talk to one another about difficult concepts, because they lack the ability to do so without resorting to violent words or violent actions. So we build walls between each other and echo chambers that we live in that make us feel safe because we are not challenged. You know, I've served on the education committee since I first came to the House, and in that first session, we were still passing laws to reduce the number of standardized tests required. And I agreed with that policy, but the argument that was made then and sticks with me now is that we need to do this to give teachers more freedom and flexibility. More flexibility so that instead of having to teach to the test, they can teach life skills. So that they have the freedom to respond to current events happening in real time and be able to tailor their lessons to empower our students with a skill set to navigate and better understand the events that we're all living through. We did have a great deal of discussion in committee about whether or not this bill would prevent educators from teaching our current events honestly. And we were told that there's a difference between what has happened in this country and what is happening. And that's where this bill tries to draw the line. But I just have to ask, At what point did what we call history stop? It cannot have been with the Emancipation Proclamation, because then we had Jim Crow and the Klan. It cannot have been with the Civil Rights Movement and desegregation, because then they killed Medgar Evers and Dr. King. It cannot have been with the election of Barack Obama, because then we had Donald Trump. We are living in very difficult days. The families of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor would surely agree. And so I just want to name the elephant in this room. This bill and the national version that it was modeled after are a clear response to the discomfort and fear expressed by many folks who share my skin tone. To be sure, this bill is whiter than the paper it's printed on. But here's the thing. Honestly, learning the history of this country should make white people uncomfortable. If our white public school students are learning about the continued impact of slavery and are coming home feeling uncomfortable, that's a good thing. It means we're teaching a generation of young Georgians to be people of conscience, to have empathy, to understand that we're still working on this to this very day to build that more perfect union. What this bill is not going to do is satisfy the people you aim to please. I spoke with the folks who came to the committee hearings, and do you know what they want banned? Pride flags, books written by African Americans that discuss their own lived experiences. They want to end the entire concept of public education by letting parents pull their kids out of class at the first hurdle and send them along with their tax money to private schools that teach that racism is over. The American experiment in equality was and is ongoing and imperfect venture. It's not too long ago that being a gay man like me was pretty divisive, and it may still be to some of you, I don't know. But we talked about it, and this country grew. And last year, I was able to marry the love of my life, a man. Something unthinkable once upon a time to a little boy in Griffin. We cannot keep catering to the worst actors in our politics. Our nation is so divided, and our political discourse so toxic. This bill will only deepen the wound. It will only further widen the gap that exists between us. But it's an election year. So I'll watch the board here in a bit, and we'll go home for the weekend. But this is not over. Our history is not over. And it will remember us for what we've said and done. On this vote, I'll sleep just fine. I yield the will.
Chair recognizes Representative Brad Thomas to speak to the bill. Going once, twice, 3 times. Chair recognizes Chairman Setzler to speak to the bill.